What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my biggest gaming disappointments, and while that is not a subject I love to cover personally, as somebody who primarily reviews games, it is something that is just inherently going to come up, and I do think it's important to talk about every once in a while. But in this particular case, the reason I'm talking about it is because just recently, thanks to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 and its DLC fiasco, I was reminded that sometimes things can be incredibly disappointing. Like, for instance, a horrible DLC practice that is probably going to ruin the goodwill that a game that has been through development hell really needed. In fact, with all the gameplay and everything that's coming out, I think a lot of people had kind of been cautiously optimistic that that game was going to turn out really well. And in truth, it still might in terms of gameplay, but then doing a day one DLC that locks a third of the clans off is, I think, to put it judiciously, disappointing. Which obviously got me thinking about other things in the gaming landscape that I found disappointing, which is obviously what we're doing here. Now, while typically every year I talk about the games that year that didn't really land for me and were disappointing in some way or another, this is going a little broader than that. This is just kind of all across the board, and that means you'll likely have heard me talk about one or two of these previously if you watch like every day. But these are the ones that I would say kind of stung the most. That said, though, what really tends to cause that to happen, at least for me anyway, is your expectations going into something. So there are plenty of games I don't like, but if I go into that experience kind of expecting not to like it and then I don't like it, that just kind of met my expectations. I wouldn't really call it a disappointing experience. What tends to usually be the actual case is that you go into something expecting to have a good time, and it fails to live up to those expectations in some way. The ever easy example of this is Cyberpunk 2077, especially on PC. You see, if you played that game on PC, the bugs and stuff weren't nearly as bad as they were elsewhere. But what you'd also find is that the experience overall in the game they made didn't really live up to what was advertised either, which was also, in its own way, very disappointing. And obviously they went to great lengths to fix it, and it's much better now. But it was an infamous launch that makes for an easy example, as I mentioned. Now, in my case, it just so happens that I got a taste of expectations getting out of control relatively early in my adult life, anyway. So first up, we're going to talk about Diablo 3, a game that I built up in my own head so much that it was just never going to live up to what I wanted it to be. But also, I wouldn't say Diablo 3 is outright bad, I would just say it was mostly okay, and somehow that stung worse than it being bad at the time. Now, to paint a bit of a picture here, Diablo 3 released a couple weeks before my birthday in 2012, my 19th birthday to be specific. Now that's important because that was around the time that I had finally gotten on my own 2 feet after being homeless for a couple years as a teenager. But at that time I had settled into living on my own, supporting myself, that kind of thing. And then here comes the official release of Diablo 3, a game whose development I had been following for years, kind of hearing about it on and off, but also mainly because I loved Diablo 2, as I've talked about previously as well. I played that game an honestly unhealthy amount when I was in middle school as a bit of a refuge from the outside world, as, obviously I grew up homeless as a teenager. Things weren't going well before that. And lucky me, Diablo 2 was a fantastic game that I really dove into, and as a result, I wanted the sequel to be as equally amazing, and then, I'm out here supporting myself for the first time, and Diablo 3 is about to release, and I was super into it. And as anybody who remembers Diablo 3's launch would probably tell you, it obviously failed to live up to that. There were all sorts of your typical login issues, as online-only games have always run into, and in many ways, I'd actually blame this specific situation for being one of the reasons that a lot of ARPGs like this not having a single-player offline mode really bothers me these days. But also there were other things to contend with, the real money auction house, that was its own big drama. And a bunch of other factors like the in-game and how some of the stacks of that buff that would lock you into a build and stuff. And then, eventually Diablo 3 went on to grow from some of that stuff, and it turned out fine, obviously. I'm sure it was very successful for Blizzard after all, but my big takeaway from that really is just that it was not Diablo 2, neither mechanically, visually. It didn't really feel like it was innovating on a lot of stuff, and it mostly just felt perfectly okay, and I was really bummed out about it. Kind of stopped playing it after just a couple of weeks of binging it, really, and then jumped in for a season or two here and there over the years, but that was kind of it. However, that feeling of bitter disappointment, especially after, loving the previous entry so much, really stuck with me, and in many ways it went on to, I would say, characterize how I feel about other games, because while I can certainly still get disappointed, obviously, I basically approach every game these days with a healthy dose of expectations, to where if something doesn't live up to my standards, it's a bummer, but it's not like something I need to throw a tantrum about on the internet. But while we're obviously starting out strong, we still got plenty to go, because next up we've got the Waylanders. Now, the Waylanders had a ton of potential to be an incredibly interesting CRPG that ultimately went really south really fast. So, if you've never heard of the Waylanders, it was a kickstarted CRPG, and in fact it took a lot of things from something like Dragon Age Origins. It took place across 2 different time periods, dealt with a lot of like Celtic mythology, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, when that game released, it was almost unplayable. In fact, technically speaking, it's possible to beat that game even today. But it is extremely unlikely that you will be able to, as it is an incredibly busted game. Like, to this day, I think there's like 7 or so like side quests for like companions and things that are just straight up uncompletable, as a great many of its quests, both main and side, will just lock on you. You'll sometimes run into invisible walls that make things impassable, and it's honestly just a really horrible experience. And perhaps unsurprisingly then, I would say, the game was just outright abandoned shortly after that. I think they never even fulfilled all their Kickstarter obligations, and oftentimes you may very well hear me when I'm talking about Kickstarter projects explain that I absolutely refuse to endorse them, and this game is one of those reasons why, because even when you have a successful Kickstarter project with people that have worked in the industry for a long time, things like that, it's possible for things to go sideways, and I just frankly don't want to attach my name to something like that just has way too many variables and all of these other factors that you have to take into account when choosing whether or not to, to contribute to crowdfunding in that way. And simply put, it's just very volatile, and I obviously don't know those people personally. But ultimately, this was so disappointing because it was a promising CRPG that failed to deliver in basically the worst way possible and was ultimately abandoned. Which brings us to our third entry, none other than Elex 2. Quite honestly, the death knell of Piranha Bytes, as it turns out, which is disappointing all on its own. But unsurprisingly, if you've ever heard me talk about it, I kind of loved the original Elex, surprisingly so. I got super into that game. It's a janky, weird little mess, but man oh man does it just hit the right chords for me. I loved the first Elex. And if I had known Piranha Bytes' penchant for kind of underwhelming sequels at times, outside of maybe Gothic 2, this may have caught me a little less by surprise. But Elex 2 I was obviously excited about after enjoying the first game so much, and while I went into it really wanting to enjoy it, Elex 2 is just rough in so many ways. For starters, they changed like how the game was presented in terms of like graphics and things like that. I think they changed engine or something. And some of it looks okay, but some of it just somehow looks worse than the original game. A lot of the plot elements, unfortunately, don't really go anywhere either. They set you up having a son in this one after setting a canon romance from the first title as well, but your son is barely in it. In fact, I would go so far as to call the main character, Jax, probably one of the worst fathers in video games I've ever seen, as a matter of fact. On top of that, much of the writing across the board is pretty bad. So many of the missions turned into just like, go kill X number of monsters, and while that is a common enough thing across Piranha Bytes games, it is excessive here. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole host of other problems. The controls, the fact that the world itself doesn't even feel nearly as lived in as the original, as an example. And the whole thing honestly just feels rushed, and if I had to guess, it probably was. Now, what makes this sting even worse, though, is that, like most of Piranha Bytes games, it was intended to be a trilogy, so Elex 2 is all we're ever going to get. We're never going to see whatever the third entry was, which means there are a bunch of questions left unanswered as they were deliberately setting up that third project. And going from a game where the original was incredible, the sequel was disappointing, to just never getting the third one because things went so poorly, I think pretty much sums up the situation around Elex 2 about as well as I could with this explanation, as it really is just a shame to me. But that brings us to number 4. which is none other than Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Now, this is one I wanted to include because it's a little different than the others. In fact, many of you might know where I'm going with this already, as I have mentioned this before in places previously already. But basically, the actual gameplay and content of Jedi Survivor is awesome. Had a great time with it. There was an extremely long puzzle platforming section that I didn't care for, but otherwise, mostly had an awesome time. But what is incredibly disappointing about Star Wars Jedi Survivor, or at least especially more so around its launch, is that it was incredibly busted. You could play it, you could finish it, everything. It was something you could complete, but doing it was probably not going to be very fun. Because in terms of technical problems, this game was flush with them. You're talking bad optimization, crashes, stutters, regular old bugs you're going to have to reload for, things like that. And unfortunately, it was a case where I actually enjoy the game itself, but it runs so poorly, especially on PC, that I just could not recommend it. Especially when it was launching in a state that made it pretty clear, there's just no way that EA or Respawn didn't understand that this was not in a state to be released, frankly. And while it has gotten a bit better, this is still not a situation that has entirely rectified itself, as the fact that I'm making this video 2 years past its release date and still talking about it probably shows you. But while there are mods and things that can help out with some of these performance problems, it still doesn't work for everybody. You can find reviews as recently as this month talking about how very, very poorly this game runs, which is its own kind of disappointing. Because while there are many reasons to be disappointed in a video game, an interesting thing about the medium itself is that it's also a product in the sense that, it has to actually function at a core level. And while there will never be a game that is 100% bug-free, Jedi Survivor unfortunately far exceeded what I would consider a tolerable level of poor performance. But that does bring us to our final entry, and a much more recent one at that, with none other than Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, I really wanted to throw this one in here specifically because it's a video game that I went a bit against the grain on in terms of my review, as it's not one I recommended. I was pretty let down by it, and yet it's a game that did very well in terms of its actual release and how players overall received it. Reviews in general were actually a little mixed, and strangely enough, I would say more reviews agreed with kind of my side of things. Review outlets, as an example, were kind of all over the place. Some people loved it, and then there were plenty of others like myself that weren't a fan ultimately. But with the actual player base, it did very well. In fact, I believe it was that is to say, Ubisoft's second best-selling Assassin's Creed, something like that. But I think the reason that it was disappointing for me specifically is that it was kind of my return to the Assassin's Creed franchise, as I hadn't really played one since the second one. And unfortunately, I would have to say it was kind of like a bit of a culture shock in some ways. Basically, the thing I wanted from an Assassin's Creed game was the part with Naue, where you are stealthing around, being an assassin, performing assassinations. There is a mechanic in-game where you can either, via the menu, choose just automatic assassinations where your assassinates will always work, but the default option is that enemies have health segments and you have to build up your assassinations via items, skills, things like that just give you more health segments when you go to perform an assassination, and kind of building up an assassinate that would actually take out an incredibly tanky target in a single hit was fun for me. And that, on top of just being an Assassin's Creed game set in Japan, which seems like a no-brainer, but it took this long to actually make it happen, were the parts of the game that I enjoyed. And yet, so much of that experience that I wanted to have was just surrounded by so much stuff that was either uninteresting or just outright bad to me. To give an example, you had the microtransaction store. I did not realize how over the top they had gotten with that. Wasn't a fan of that at all, but even other stuff, which wasn't outright bad or anything, just wasn't really the experience I wanted to have. For instance, playing as Yasuke, you have a character that is just insanely overpowered and basically unkillable. And that was the exact opposite of being a stealthy assassin that I wanted to be. And overall, it was just an experience that didn't land for me on a fundamental level in a way that I would say surprised me, which is what led to the disappointment. Now, I will say the ending of my experience also didn't help matters either. If you've played that game, the ending is very underwhelming, and it's clear they plan to continue it via an expansion to actually give you whatever the proper ending is supposed to be. And honestly, it's always kind of annoying when games do that, but If you watched my review, you may well know that I also ran into a strange bug towards the end of it, where like one of the last few cutscenes of the game was triggering some sort of bug that no amount of reloading or, backing up and trying again fixed. But basically there was a certain cutscene at the end of the game that the second I went through it, my character was no longer able to sprint, which means the last couple hours of things I had to get done, I had to do at just walking speed because the game just wouldn't let me do it. And for all of those reasons, I think Assassin's Creed might very well be a perfect example of what I said at the very beginning. When you go into a game with certain expectations and it fails to live up to those, you're bound to be a little disappointed. And in this case, I went into Assassin's Creed expecting a particular type of experience, and that was simply not the experience that I had. And the thing I wanted to do was surrounded by a million things I did not want to do and did not enjoy, which is obviously what it's doing on this particular list. But ultimately, those are just the games that I found particularly disappointing. Now, I imagine you have plenty of your own. I'm pretty sure I could name a few off the top of my head that I'm sure people will mention in the comments, but while you are obviously more than welcome to talk about the games that you found disappointing, I would actually also be curious to hear about games that exceeded your expectations, just to keep things a little more positive, as it frankly makes for a bit of an easier read when I go through the comments later. It's a little less of a bummer, to be honest. But that obviously does, of course, mean to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Getting to play and review games, whether they are disappointing or some of the best experiences I've ever had in games, is by far and away the best job I have ever had, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. So truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.